United with Christ. Meet local churches with open doors serving throughout the Border Valley community and sharing the truth and hope of God's love and salvation. A presentation by KSCE Channel 38 Christian Television. And now, United with Christ.
Hello, my name is Doug Coyle. I am pastor of Grace Covenant Church in Las Cruces, New Mexico. You can learn more about our church at our website, www.gccnm.com. We also have two sister churches here in El Paso, Christ the King on the west side of El Paso and Las Tierras on the east side of El Paso. I want to begin by putting a word on the board for you. Today's word will be in Hebrew. The Old Testament part of your Bible, that part of your Bible written before Jesus came, was written in Hebrew. And here's our word for the day. It's the Hebrew word Dama. I'll write that out for you, Dama. And you recall that you read Hebrew in the opposite direction, so that's Dama. And what this word means is to liken or to compare. And we will learn about this word from Isaiah chapter 40. Do you have great thoughts about God or little thoughts about God? A.W. Tozer once said, "What comes into your mind when you think about God is the most important thing about you." He went on to say, without a doubt, the mightiest thought that the mind can entertain is the thought of God and of His greatness. One of the things that I love is philosophy. I really enjoy apologetics. And I've been doing these lessons here for several months, and I don't think I've yet gone off on a philosophical tangent. At the church that I pastor, probably every other sermon I go off on a philosophical tangent for my congregation because I love philosophy and I love apologetics. And one of my favorite theologian philosophers is a man by the name of Anselm. And he was a medieval theologian and philosopher. And he once tried to come up with a new argument for the existence of God. There are many ways to try and prove the existence of God. Some will use the cosmological argument. In other words, the argument from God must be the ultimate cause. Or the design argument. You look at the fact that this world is designed. There must be a designer. Well, Anselm came up with a very unique argument for the existence of God. And his argument was this one. The ontological argument for the existence of God. Ontological, ontos, simply has the idea of being. What Anselm wanted to do was have human beings do a thought experiment wherein you think about the idea of being, but particularly what is the greatest being that you can think of? And I'll just go off on a philosophical tangent just for about a minute here. What is the greatest being you can think of? What's the greatest creature you can think of? In other words, what creature has the most wisdom you could possibly think of, most power you could possibly think of, who's most righteous, who's most good? What's the greatest being you can possibly think of? And we would say that that being is God. And then Anselm asks this question. Is that being greater if he only exists in my mind, or is that being greater if he exists in reality? In other words, the greatest being that you can conceive or think of is not one that's merely in your mind as a concept, but the greatest being you can think of is one who actually has real existence, therefore God exists. Now if you got lost on that, maybe you can TiVo the show tomorrow and listen to it a few times. But it's called the ontological argument. But here's the point. He bases this argument on the greatness of God. He thought the greatness of God was worth contemplating, worth thinking about. Do you think about the greatness of God? If you go to secular bookstores today, they'll say just the opposite. I think it was Christopher Hitchens, the atheist, who wrote a book, God is Not Great. You go into many Christian bookstores today, they don't have books on the greatness of God. It's books on how to do your finances better or how to control your blood pressure in a biblical way. but we rarely come across books and even messages on the greatness of God. Here in Isaiah 40, Isaiah sets before us the greatness of God. What is your conception of God? Is your conception of God simply an impersonal cosmic force? Do you tend to think of God as Mother Nature? He just controls the laws of nature? Do you think of God as just a cosmic policeman? That He's just up in the sky tabulating when we've done right and when we've done wrong, and God is maybe like a cosmic Cub Scout leader who sees whether you've done enough merits, enough good things. God perhaps is some cosmic roadblock to our fun. Maybe your conception of God is that He's just a nice grandfather, that God is kind of my co-pilot in life, and He's just maybe my celestial cheerleader. That's what God is. Or maybe your conception of God is a hazy conception. J.B. Phillips once said that many people conceive of God as simply an oblong blur. In other words, God is just the great generic whatever. God is this cosmic blur. Many people, when they think of God, it's not great thoughts of God, but it's God's the cosmic vending machine. In other words, God exists for me. God exists for my personal prosperity. God exists for my personal healing. He's the great Florence Nightingale in the sky, my own cosmic nurse. If any of these things describe you, I know one thing about you, and that is that you don't worship God. If those are your conceptions of God, then you don't worship Him, or at best, your worship is flippant or shallow. In Isaiah 40, the prophet Isaiah sets before us a great vision of God that should evoke in you a great worship of God. In Isaiah chapter 40, the people of God are in despair. They've been conquered by Babylon. They have lost their homes. They've lost their country. Everything has been taken away. And they're crying out to God, God, do you care? God, can you even do anything? God, do you hear our prayers? All this evil has come upon us. Everything has been taken away and we are despondent. And they're wondering, God, do you hear? Do you care? Can you even do anything? And in Isaiah 40, God shows up. God appears. And by the end of the end of Isaiah 40, the people are changed. Let me read to you Isaiah 40:31, which is probably a verse you know, but I wonder if you really know it in its context. Isaiah 40 verse 31 says, "But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." That's how this chapter ends. But how does he get there? He gets there by displaying for you the greatness of God. So let's go through this. We're going to begin at verse 12 and see the greatness of God described for us. Now, the Bible describes the greatness of God in numerous ways. For example, in 1 Samuel 2, verse 22, the Bible describes God's greatness in just a straightforward, direct, positive way. It'll say, God is great. The Bible can also describe God's greatness in a negative way. For example, in 1 Samuel 2, verse 2, the Bible says, no one is like God. No one is as great as God. And so those are two ways that the Bible describes God's greatness. But here in Isaiah 40, Isaiah takes a different approach to describing the greatness of God. He tells us the greatness of God through a series of rhetorical questions. Now, you remember what a rhetorical question is, because this is the type of question that your mother used to ask you when you were growing up. When I would come home as a junior high or high school student, I would come home from practice and I would take my sweaty jersey off and my sweaty socks and I'd throw them right in the middle of the living room, and my mom would look at me and she'd ask me this rhetorical question: do I look like a maid? Now, she wasn't wanting an answer. She didn't want me to answer that and say, yes, you are my maid, or no, you're not. It was a rhetorical question, which means it's actually a statement. My mom was saying, I'm not your maid, pick up your clothes. Or perhaps you tried to ask your mom to do something when she was really busy and she looked at you and said, does it look like I have 3 arms? No, she's not asking you to answer that question. She's actually making a statement. I only have 2 arms. I can only do so much. Or that classical question that mothers ask when they look at you and they say, do I look stupid? Now, you may have been tempted to answer, but you didn't, because you knew that that was a rhetorical question. Your mom was actually making a statement towards you. She was making a direct quote to you saying, I'm not stupid, I know what you're doing. Here in Isaiah, he does a similar thing. God asks a series of rhetorical questions, and in asking these rhetorical questions, he's actually making a statement. He's actually saying something profound about himself and his greatness. So let's go through this and look at all these different rhetorical questions that set before our eyes the greatness of the God who is. Verse 12. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? So verse 12, who has measured the waters of the earth? This earth is 2/3 water. That means that this earth holds 100 million square miles of water. A square mile is a block of water that is a mile long by a mile long by a mile long. It's a square block, a mile. And we have 100 million of those on planet Earth. And here's what God says in an anthropomorphic way. This is not literal, it's anthropomorphic. And God says that He measures the water in the hollow of His hand. 100 million square miles. I love playing basketball. I actually played basketball in college, so anytime I have a chance to play basketball, I do it. I play in backyards, I play in front yards, I play basketball in gyms, and I play basketball at the park. And a lot of times when you play basketball at a park, if you don't pay attention, you might not see a drinking fountain. And sometimes you do see a drinking fountain, and after you play in a park, playing basketball for an hour and a half, 2 hours, you are thirsty, you are dehydrated. And I recall numerous times I'd go over to a drinking fountain in a park, and I'm dehydrated, and I'd press the little knob so the water would come out, and it would just dribble out. And so I had only one alternative, because I wasn't going to put my mouth on that faucet. It was in public. So I'd put my hand out, and I'd get just a little bit of water, and then I'd slurp it. But it would do virtually nothing for me, because I could get hardly any water in the hollow of my hand. God asked the rhetorical question, who can measure all of the water of this earth in the hollow of His hand? God's making a statement, He can do that. And then He says, or with the breadth of His hand mark off the heavens. Today we have rulers. That's how we measure things. We have measuring tapes. My brother's a contractor and would carry a measuring tape everywhere he goes, so he could measure things. Well, in the ancient world, they didn't have rulers and measuring tape. So the way they would measure things was through using your hand, and from your thumb to your forefinger was considered a hand breadth, and that's how you could measure something. So you could measure a person and say, oh, you're about 13 hands tall, or 13 hands and 1 pinky tall. That's how tall you are. Imagine if someone said to you, hey, can you measure my room? And if you lived in the ancient world, you're probably like, yeah, I can measure your room, but this is going to take a while, so I'm going to have to do my hands all the way through it. What if someone said to you when you lived in the ancient world, can you measure the whole city of El Paso, or the whole city of Las Cruces, or the distance from El Paso to Las Cruces? Well, you'd think that was crazy. That would take forever to measure that hand by hand by hand. What if someone said to you, can you measure the whole universe by using your hands? The universe is absolutely massive. It's immense. Light travels at 186,000 miles per second. So a light year is how far light would travel in a full year, going at almost 200,000 miles per second. Our universe is 28 billion light years big, and God says, who of you can measure this universe with just using your hands? God is making a statement that He can do that. That's how immense He is. That's how great He is. That's how big He is. Verse 13. Who has understood the mind of the Lord, or instructed Him as counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? And who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge, or showed God the path of understanding? So here we see the greatness of God in His wisdom. God is omniscient. God knows everything. Who of us can be His counselor? Who of us, he asks, can teach God knowledge? Who of us can show God, here's the path of understanding and enlightenment? No, God knows everything. God knows a word before it's on our mouth. God knows the past, God knows the present, and God knows the future, and God knows it all instantly. Let me try and give you an example of what God's knowledge and wisdom is like compared to ours. I'm going to hold up a few pictures here, and I want you to see how fast you can identify what it is you're seeing. So here's the first picture. As I put it up, I imagine you can identify it fairly quickly. And you probably say to yourself instantly, that's 2 marbles. Let me put up another picture for you. And I think everyone out there in TV land is probably saying, oh, instantly, 4 marbles. Now let me show you another picture. And now you're probably looking at that, and you're thinking, oh, maybe what, 8, 9, 10 marbles? And now it's getting a little bit more difficult for your brain to comprehend instantly what it is you're seeing. Let me give you another picture. How about that? Can you instantly tell with your wisdom and understanding how many marbles are on that page? I think I counted, it was right around 50 in case you're wondering. Let me put up one more though. Can your mind comprehend how many marbles are there in an instant? What the Bible's telling you about the wisdom of God is that He knows this the way we know 2 marbles. He knows exactly how many are there in an instant, the same way we might identify 2 marbles. That's how great God's knowledge is, but it's not just marbles, it's the whole world. It's the entire past, the entire present, and the entire future. That's how wise God is. That's His knowledge and understanding. It is great. Verse 15. Here God talks about His greatness over the nations. Surely the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before Him all the nations are as nothing. They are regarded by Him as worthless and less than nothing. Here the nations are called a drop in the bucket. If I ask my boys, well, hey, will you wash my car today, and I want you to use all the water in the bucket. And if I came out a half hour later and I notice that there's one little drop in the bucket, I'm not going to say, hey, you missed a drop. I need you to put that on my car and wash it. That would be absurd. It's just a little drop. God also says that not only are the nations a drop in the bucket, they're like dust on a scale. I want you to imagine you're in your bathroom and you're standing on your scale to see how much you weigh. Now when you're younger, you just step on it. When you get older like me, well, you take your shoes off, you take your shirt off, you take your watch off, you pull your contacts out because you want it to be as low as possible. But one thing you don't do is flick the dust from the scale. Why? Because it's nothing. Dust weighs nothing. Here the nations are like dust on a scale. But we tend to think, well, what about our religiosity? What about the things I do for God, the sacrifices I make, the good things I do? Here in verse 16, Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, nor all of its animals for burnt offerings. Here God's saying, your religiosity is nothing. You see, we give gifts to people based upon their worth, and God is worth everything. He's of infinite worth. And so us offering a wooden altar and offering animals is nothing. And here He says all the wood and animals of Lebanon. In the Middle East, that was like saying all the wood of the Pacific Northwest. Make an altar out of it. It's nothing. All of the animals of the Pacific Northwest, sacrifice them. They're nothing. Our religiosity is nothing before the greatness and the infinite worth of God. And if nations are nothing, how much more us as individuals? Verse 18. He then turns to talking about our idols. To whom then will you compare God? What image will you compare Him to? As for an idol, a craftsman casts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold, and fashions silver chains for it. A man too poor to present such an offering selects wood that will not rot. He looks for a skilled craftsman to set up an idol that will not topple. So here God says our great problem is that we have idols. We want to be God and make things out of this creation that will make us happy and satisfy us. And God says, look, you can overlay a piece of wood with gold and silver, and it's just a piece of wood that will rot and fall away. And here it's rich people who get a little sculpture or a piece of wood and overlay it in gold. They have idols. And God says they're nothing. And even poor people do that. He talks about those who are poor in verse 20, and they just offer a piece of wood, and they carve it into some statue. God says even the poor people have idols. Whether you're rich or poor, you have idols. Because we all think that something in this creation, rather than the Creator, will satisfy us and make us happy. Whether it's riches and wealth, a home, a husband, a wife, whatever it might be, we make idols out of everything. And God says they'll all rot, and they'll all topple, and they'll all fall away. There is nothing compared to me, the one who's created everything. And then in verse 21, he talks specifically to people and individuals. He says, do you not know? Have you not heard? Has it not been told to you from the beginning? Have you not understood since the earth was founded? God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and its people are like grasshoppers. He stretches out the heavens like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. So here he says in verse 22, God sits enthroned above the circle of the earth, and we are as grasshoppers. Humans are compared here, not to lions. We are not compared to stars in the sky. We're compared to bugs before God. We're like grasshoppers. I love reading books. I'm a bibliophile, which means I love to read. And from time to time, I'll grab an old book and I'll pull it out and I'll start reading it. And I got to push some of the dust off of it. But I'll be reading it and turning its pages, and all of a sudden I'll see something that's microscopic that looks like it's moving across the page. And it's teeny tiny, and I'll try and focus in on it. And it's a little bug that's scampering across the pages of my book. And I'll think to myself, that's a cool little guy. He likes books. And I used to see these little insects and think, man, those are cute little fellas. They're my friends. Then one day I Googled what that bug was, and I found out that that bug is actually book lice. In other words, it's a form of lice. And so now what I do is when those bugs go across my page, rather than flicking them off the page, what I do is I put them in a jar. And for my enemies, I put it underneath their pillows. Just kidding. What I do now, though, when I see those bugs scampering across my page because it's bug lice, I flick it off of my book. I don't want them on there. It's book lice, and so I get rid of it. And here God is comparing us, again, not to lions and stars, but to bugs, to insects, to grasshoppers. That's how we are before His greatness. And now verse 23. Here God says that kings and princes and famous people are nothing before Him. We tend to idolize people from Hollywood or athletes or politicians. God says they're nothing. Verse 23, He brings princes to naught and reduces the rulers of this world to nothing. No sooner are they planted, no sooner are they sown, no sooner do they take root in the ground than God blows on them and they wither away, and a whirlwind sweeps them away like chaff. God says kings and presidents and famous people are nothing. Louis XIV was king of France and was very pompous and arrogant, and he loved himself. And he set up his own funeral to be done in a very specific way to highlight his own greatness. During his funeral, he had all the lights turned out to where the room was completely dark. And then he had one candle that was to be lit atop his coffin, so that everyone's eyes in this darkened room would be fixed upon this coffin with a candle upon it, which was Louis XIV's coffin. He wanted everybody to be looking at him, everyone remembering him, even in his death. And the story goes that at his funeral, when this was done, and the candle was lit in that darkened room before this massive audience, that a priest walked up and blew out that candle, and then was heard to say, "Only God is great." You see, only God is great. The famous people of this world, they're nothing. They're like chaff. That comparison he gives at the end of verse 24, he says they're like chaff. God blows on them and they flow away. Here's what chaff is like. Imagine if I got a Kleenex or a tissue and ripped it into just thousands of little pieces. And then I put them in my hand, and then I grabbed these rocks, and I put these rocks in my hand, and I mixed it all together, and then I blew on it. Those rocks would stay, and that tissue would fly away. That's chaff. Chaff is nothing. It has no weight to it. That's what God says about the people of Hollywood or famous athletes or politicians, those who want to make a name for themselves. They are nothing. So then verse 25, we come to this great statement. To who then will you compare me? Who will you liken me to? Or who is my equal, says the Holy One. And here's our word. After this description of rhetorical questions telling us how great God is, God says, Dama, who will you liken me to? What will you compare me to? And the answer is you simply can't. God is great. God is majesty upon majesty. When we look at creation, it's nothing. This world is nothing. God can hold all the waters in the hollow of His hand. God can measure this massive universe by merely using His hands. The nations are as nothing. There is a drop in the bucket. We are like insects. We are like bugs compared to God. So now we finish this and we ask this question, how does this help me? I'm in despair. I've lost everything. And God says, hey, good. Now I want you to see you're a nothing. How does that help me? How does it help me to see that I'm a nothing, that I'm prone to idolatry, that I'm like an insect? Here's how it helps you. What God is saying is, don't hope in yourself. Don't hope in yourself. Isaiah 40 verse 31, our final verse. But those who hope in the Lord, He will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint. Hope in God. And specifically, how do we hope in God? Well, in Isaiah 40 verse 1, the first thing He says is comfort, comfort. God's coming to comfort you. Then in verse 9 He says, and I bring you good tidings. I bring you a gospel. I bring you good news. And right in between those verses, 1 through 9, you see verse 3. And verse 3 says these words which you should be familiar with if you know your Bible. A voice of one calling in the desert, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the wilderness a highway for our God. You should be familiar with those words because they come straight from Mark chapter 1. In Mark's gospel, he says that there's one calling in the desert to prepare the way of the Lord, and then he applies that verse to who? To Jesus Christ. In other words, at the center of all of this is Jesus Christ. He's the one we are to look to for hope in this world. You see, all of the wood of Lebanon and the Pacific Northwest, all of the sacrifices are not enough to pay our infinite debt. What we need is someone of infinite value to do that for us. We need someone who is great, and that is Jesus Christ. What we need is the wood of the cross, because it's of infinite value. What we need is the sacrifice of Jesus on the cross, because He's of infinite value. Great is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross, and great is His blood. He saves us. There's our hope. Receive strength and be renewed in Him.
Thank you for watching United with Christ. We pray this has been a blessing to you, and we invite you to tune in again tomorrow. We invite your comments, questions, or prayer requests. You may contact us at KSCE Christian Television, 2201 East Wyoming Avenue, El Paso, Texas 79903, or call us at 915-532-8588 during regular business hours, or you can visit us on our website at www.ksce.com. God bless you.